Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to Practical Christian Lessons. We have Daniel Hickson here, and today we are going to be talking about some of the renewal movements in the history of recent Methodism. So let's go and get on into that. If anyone doesn't know your story, feel free to maybe give a brief synopsis. I'll link the video of your own experience in the UMC down below. For anyone who doesn't know Daniel Hickson, which if you're watching me, you should know who Daniel Hickson is for sure. He used to be a United Methodist minister. You're now, I believe, in the ACNA after leaving the UMC during the whole disaffiliation process, or rather, they removed you, and you went to the ACNA. That whole story will be down there, and you're still Wesleyan focused. You still put out a lot of great content, and you still speak into quite a few of the things that matter for the Anglican and Methodist world. So definitely a lot of appreciation for your work. But today we're going to be talking about as well the those renewal movements, so things like the confessing movement. I believe it wasn't Good News. I feel bad for forgetting their name, but I'm sure you'll tell us. And some of these movements that tried to reform and revive Methodism from within before the disaffiliation process. So feel free to start wherever you'd like.
Yeah, I'll talk a bit. We do have a little delay, so hopefully you guys can bear with us as you're watching this. I was a pastor in the United Methodist Church, I think for 17 or 18 years before I disaffiliated, and there's a kind of a long, convoluted story about some of the drama that went down, but I ended up having an open door from the Lord to go into the Anglican Church in North America. So I'm now the priest at the Mission Anglican Church in Pensacola, Florida, and it's really been a wonderful new beginning, new season for us. But I was kind of an interested observer, and to some extent a little bit involved in some of the renewal efforts that went on for many years in the United Methodist Church. And there were parallel renewal movements within other mainline denominations, and to some extent maybe there still are. But the Methodist renewal movements ultimately sort of planted the seeds for the birth of the global Methodist Church. And part of the reason for our conversation here is there's been a lot of criticism of evangelicals, traditionalists, theological conservatives who have left the mainline churches and built new institutions. And some of that is coming from Redeem Zoomer and the Reconquista folks who are saying, why didn't you guys stay and fight it out? And one of the things that I've been trying to say into that conversation is actually, we did try to stay and fight it out for almost 60 years. And you know, at some point it looked like sort of diminishing returns. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that history, because I don't think people are really well aware of it. And I'll try to point out some things that are relevant to some of the talking points or the ideas that are being discussed related to the Reconquista movement. And this is just, I hope, to bring light to the conversation and maybe a little less heat. So does that sound good with you? And anything else you want me to address first?
No, I think that's good. I say I can also direct people, because I don't think we're going to talk about, what is schism itself, though that's related to this conversation. I do have an article I recently put up on Substack, and there's some things I want to put out as clarifying comments after talking with the Methodist branch of the Reconquista and having some conversations with them. But that's up on my Substack that I'll link it below, and that will be related to this conversation, but not quite directly on topic. So I'm not going to try and derail it here. If anyone wants to go read it, they can down below. But I think that's a very good summary and introduction for the topic.
That's very good. And people should read your article. There's a lot of conversation right now about like what even is schism, because the New Testament does tell us to disassociate from people, including leaders, in certain circumstances. And so at what point are we being obedient and what point are we being sinful, I think is part of the question here. But I'll start with the history of Methodism a little bit. as you probably know if you've paid much attention, the Methodist movement started as an organized revival movement within the Anglican Church, the Church of England. And you had John and Charles Wesley and other leaders preaching, organizing people into small group ministries of different kinds, classes and bands and everything. And for 50 years, that's what Methodism was. And then you get the American War for Independence. There's a real break between the American Methodists and the Church of England, the established church. And rather than waiting for the Episcopal Church to kind of get organized, they launched, with John Wesley's help, launched a new denomination. And so I think this is relevant to the whole Reconquista discussion. The Methodists were not excommunicated or expelled or anathematized by the Anglicans. They just got to a point where they thought it was good for them to leave and set up something new for kingdom ministry work. And rightly or wrongly, that's what they did. And if you follow the logic that I've heard in some of the presentations from Reconquista folks, that was an illegitimate move, and there shouldn't even be a Methodist church. And so it's hard to use that same logic then to criticize people for leaving the United Methodist Church. But anyway, the Methodist Church grew and expanded greatly during the 1800s. It was very much involved with the Great Awakenings, and as it grew and expanded, it became more established. You had sort of the transition from big tent revival meetings out on the frontier to like Gothic brick church building on Main Street in your town, and the education level expected of the clergy also increased over that time, and the denomination began to have more requirements, and not just bring John Wesley's Christian library with you on horseback, but now you need a seminary degree or you need a college education, and these things kind of come into play. And in the late 1800s, you see this beginning in Europe, and it comes over to the United States. There are all kinds of philosophical and intellectual currents that cause people to question major aspects of the Christian faith, question the reliability of the Bible, question the historical veracity of the virgin birth, the resurrection, other miracles, events that are narrated in the Bible. And of course, this is at the same time you have the rise of science. You have, as we know it, you have the rise of all kinds of ideologies or worldviews that see history as this kind of progression toward utopia. So you've got Marxism, you've got, even in biology, you've got evolutionary biology. And so all this stuff is affecting the intellectual climate within the church. And a number of things began to grow out of that. And this is what we often talk about: theological liberalism. Some people talk about modernism. I like to use the word revisionism, though that does have a negative connotation. It is technically an accurate description. People wanted to take the received, inherited traditions and revise them. They wanted to make them more relevant to modern man, whoever that is. And so you begin to see things like the growth of the social gospel movement, which all of these movements, they weren't wholly bad, or they were saying things that were true, but they were also missing things. It wasn't the whole truth, And so by the early 20th century, there's this real, at least among the leaders, the very educated, the bishops, the seminary professors, and in many mainline churches, there's a real de-emphasizing of biblical authority. There's a de-emphasizing of the great story of sin and salvation that the Bible gives us. There's a de-emphasizing of doctrinal distinctions of the various churches. People would say things like doctrine divides, but service unites. And we all just need to kind of pray together and go feed the hungry together. And that's really what the focus needs to be. And so, which is a good thing to do, but not at the expense or to the exclusion of the theology things and the Bible things, right? So over time, there develops within all the mainline churches, but we're talking about Methodism specifically, the Methodist Episcopal Church that had originally been formed in the very late 1700s, 1780s, had a number of splits and then reunions. In the early 20th century, it was just the Methodist Church, and theological liberalism or modernism or revisionism is really taking hold. There are new ideas that are kind of percolating in the seminaries, like process theology, which denies some of the classical teachings about the nature of God that have been a part of the Christian tradition and a part of the Methodist articles of religion even. And so there are among the laity and among some of the clergy real alarm about some of the things that they hear coming from the bishops, coming from the clergy. The Sunday school curriculum in the early 20th century was, as I understand it, I wasn't there, but as I understand it, it was pretty tightly controlled. You really had to use the official denominational curriculum. You couldn't just, go on christianbook.com and get whatever you wanted to teach Sunday school in your church. You couldn't be using Max Lucado or Dave Ramsey or something like that. That was against the rules. You had to use the official curriculum, and what the official curriculum was a lot of that kind of let's be nice to each other, and aren't these interesting new ideas about God, and this is what's relevant. So in the late 1960s is really when the renewal movements really get going, and there's in those days, there was a sort of a professional magazine for Methodist clergy called The Christian Advocate. And an evangelical clergyman submitted an article saying, here's what evangelical Methodists believe, because he felt like their voice was basically unrepresented. And in response to that article, he got all these letters from clergy and laity all over the American church saying, I thought I was alone. I thought I was the only one, or nobody really believed this stuff anymore except me. And that was the beginning of the Good News movement. So I think Good News may have started officially in 1967. So even right before the merger of the Methodist Church and the Evangelical United Brethren Church, that happened in 68 to form the United Methodist Church. And if I get any of these years wrong, I'm working from memory, and y'all just correct me in the comments there. But it's pretty close. So even on the very eve of the merger, this renewal movement was beginning to get organized. And what Good News did was they began to publish a magazine advocating traditional Wesleyan theology, Wesleyan Methodist distinctives, Wesleyan evangelicalism, and they began to connect people. You're not the only one. Let's get together. Let's organize. Let's start to pray together and encourage one another and talk together about maybe how we could renew and reform the church. And they had a gathering. Let's see, I've got some notes here in Dallas, Texas. I don't remember what year this was. 1970. Good News sponsored their first national gathering. They had over 1,600 people register, and over 3,000 people show up. And there were significant theologians from United Methodist seminaries involved. Even Billy Graham sent his greetings to the conference. And Albert Outler, who was a really significant Methodist theologian and seminary professor in the mid-20th century, was supportive of what they were doing, trying to call the church back to Wesleyanism. Now, after the 68 merger, the next general conference was 1972. And there were still kind of a lot of loose ends about just merging the two denominations into one that they were tying up. And one of the things that they did at that 72 general conference, they famously added the prohibition against homosexual practice, which and the incompatible clause that people spent the next 60 years fighting about. But another thing they did that I was not even aware of for a long time is they officially embraced doctrinal pluralism. And so what did that mean was up to interpretation. Some people who were kind of on the conservative end of it thought that just meant, well, we've got a confession of faith and articles of religion, and they kind of say certain things a little differently, but all of that, there's a range of acceptable ways to say this. And other people thought it was just open season and you could basically believe anything and be a Methodist. And so I heard about one instance of a layperson calling their district superintendent and saying, our pastor says he doesn't believe in the bodily resurrection. And the district superintendent says, sorry, can't do anything about that. Pluralism. And so you can kind of see how unhealthy the leadership was when this renewal movement is starting to take root. The news movement gets going, and then other organizations, other entities begin to be formed. And there's a whole network of renewal organizations. So you have Bristol House Publishers that starts publishing alternative curriculum or curricula and material for churches to use. They get legislation passed so that they can do that. That was one of their big wins. In the early 1980s, because the General Board of Global Missions had almost completely abandoned traditional evangelism and church planting, they used the word Complementary Mission Society for United Methodists was created as a mission sending agency that put a greater focus on evangelism, on sharing the gospel, on planting churches. Another thing that happened in the 1980s that was really, really significant was there was an expose in Reader's Digest and also on 60 Minutes about how the National Council of Churches, which the United Methodist Church and other mainline churches were part of and are part of, had been funding these communist groups and that in Central and South America were connected to like violent revolutionaries and guerrillas and extremists and all this. And this was a major scandal. And the reason that expose happened is because people saw that the social gospel had kind of become conflated with Marxism in the minds of a lot of the leaders. And so a lot of these churches and church leaders were basically openly supportive of Marxism. And that has to do with the infiltration of liberation theology into the seminaries. And you can go research that if you want to learn more about it. But one of the organizations that was created in response to these concerns was the Institute of Religion and Democracy, the IRD, which worked in a number of denominations, including they had a special focus for United Methodists, among others. In the early 1990s, you saw the rise of the confessing movement, which was really focused on calling the church back to its doctrinal documents, like the Articles of Religion and the Confession of Faith, back to historic creedal orthodoxy with the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed. And again, you had significant theologians involved with the confessing movement, like Billy Abraham at Perkins, Maxie Dunham, and others at Asbury. Thomas Oden was up at Drew Seminary. There were significant bishops involved in these renewal movements. You had people like the very saintly Bishop William Ragsdale Cannon, Bishop Timothy Whitaker, Bishop Scott Jones, and several other bishops. And so what you end up with by the late 90s and the early 2000s is a network of renewal organizations. You've got the confessing movement, you've got Good News, you've got the Mission Society, you've got the Aldersgate Renewal Ministries, which had a special focus on the movements of the Holy Spirit and the charismatic gifts. It was basically a charismatic ministry affiliated with the UMC. You had, again, the confessing movement, the Mission Society. You had, I think, was it Life Watch was the pro-life organization. And so all these groups are now coordinating. They're talking to each other. When general conferences come around, they're all doing groundwork together to find allies, especially in the growing overseas conferences, the central conferences in Africa and the Philippines and Eastern Europe. And they're doing this organization. They're doing this coordinating work. And that's really when you see a lot of the legislative gains start happening in the 90s and into the 2000s. And there's a lot of momentum, and there's this is when I'm really getting involved in the church. And there's a sense that, yeah, we've kind of gone through the rough patch and we're turning the corner and we're moving into brighter days ahead. The Orthodox church parts of the church, or the growing parts, The theologically revisionist parts that were abandoning creedal orthodoxy, those were the parts that were in steep decline. And we were already starting to have some legislative wins, and it looked like our majorities in terms of Orthodox, traditional, evangelical voters were just going to grow and grow. And so it looked pretty good to me at the time when I was going through seminary. And obviously there was still a lot of disagreement. There was still a lot of animosity even between people, but it looked like the trajectory was going in a good direction. And if you want to get more detail about this history, there's a great book that I read in seminary called Turning Around the Mainline by Thomas Oden. And he traces the history of these various renewal groups and the successes that they were having. And that book is very, again, optimistic about where things were going. It wasn't all going to be easy, but it looked like we were actually going to succeed in preventing the United Methodist Church from going the way of the Episcopal Church and the Presbyterian Church and the ELCA, Presbyterian Church USA, that is. We also had, and this was an important part of this whole renewal movement, there was a, I think, pretty well-funded scholarship program, the John Wesley Fellowship and the Foundation for Theological Education. And they were helping Wesleyan Orthodox scholars get funded for seminary, for doctoral programs, helping them network to hopefully get placed in seminaries. And so it was a well-funded organization of all the network of all these renewal groups. It was involved bishops and seminary professors, thousands of clergy, many thousands of lay people who were planning, who were working together, who were advocating for change in everything from Sunday school curriculum to confirmation classes to the mission organizations to general conference legislation and the church's official teaching on hot button issues, all the stuff. There were local affiliates in many annual conferences. So when I started out, I was attending what we call the Traditional Wesleyan Fellowship in our conference, which eventually, like a lot of these groups, came under the umbrella of the Wesleyan Covenant Association, the WCA. So that's kind of the background. So we've got this, and this is where I feel like some of the videos I've seen from Redeem Zoomer and the Reconquista, especially a couple of years ago, when I was really paying more attention, they were really excited. They had like 3 or 4 clergymen involved from a whole denomination, and it's like, well, okay, all movements start small. That's fine. But there seemed to be a lack of awareness of this vast, well-funded, well-organized effort that had already been run in the United Methodist Church. And in a sense, you could say it was successful. It culminated in the 2019 special session of General Conference to sort of solve, quote unquote, the church's disagreements over human sexuality and the underlying differences about the Bible and authority and interpretation and all the other issues, the nature of sin and holiness and everything that was kind of balled up into that discussion. So the traditionalists are basically holding the line at the General Conference level in 08 and 12 and 2016. And 2016, in my opinion, is the year everything really broke, because after General Conference, I think it was after General Conference. It must have been. Conference would have been in May. The jurisdictional conferences met in the summer. And there was a candidate for bishop who was openly living in a lesbian relationship in the Western jurisdiction in California. And despite the General Conference reaffirming the traditional teaching that clergy and same-sex relationships are not allowed to serve in the United Methodist Church, there are no clergy and same-sex relationships if we're playing by the rules. And despite other jurisdictional conferences pleading with them not to do this, the Western jurisdiction elected this person in a same-sex relationship. The other bishops of that jurisdiction consecrated her to be a bishop. in the United Methodist Church. And I was on vacation with another clergy colleague and his family at the beach when this happened. And I remember looking at him and I said, when you've got a situation where you have bishops that some people recognize as valid and legitimate in your church and other people recognize as invalid or illegitimate, that's when you really have a visible break, because now that calls into question everybody that bishop ordains. Are they even really ordained? And so it unleashes a whole bunch of other problems. And of course, bishops are supposed to be the sign and safeguard of the unity of the church. And this move actually was doing the exact opposite. So the General Conference of 2016, because it looked like things were really tense and on the breaking point, they had called for the bishops to basically do something, as we often do when there's a crisis. We don't maybe have a good idea of what to do, but we just tell our leaders, do something. And that's not always a good thing. But they conducted this process. They called for a special session of General Conference, and they basically, through a process of conversation with different leaders and stakeholders, they put forward 3 proposals about how to restructure or organize the church to try to deal with the divisions. And of the 3, it was clear the bishops all wanted the one that kind of segregated the church into a conservative body and a progressive or revisionist body, and they would have sort of some degree of institutional separation. And so that you could have a, First United Conservative Methodist Church in your town, and then a faith progressive United Methodist Church in your town. And they would both be United Methodist, but they would be teaching different things, and they would be practicing different things in terms of holy matrimony and in terms of other issues. But what the special session General Conference in 2019 did was they elected to go with what was known as the traditional plan. And this was, we're going to double down on our current biblical Orthodox teaching, and we're going to turn up the heat on those who refuse to abide by it. And we're going to have more robust accountability and punishments for clergy who basically don't play by the rules that they made a promise to play by when they were ordained. This was just too harsh, I think, for a lot of the squishy middle in kind of American Methodism. And so what happened after that special session chose the traditional plan, at least in my conference, and I think this happened elsewhere, was not only did the progressives get more serious about organizing to elect delegates for the next 2020 General Conference, but a lot of the kind of moderate folks who in the past had not really come down hard on one side or the other, or maybe they'd voted for traditionalists, a lot of them swung over to vote with progressives. And so whereas my conference usually had about a maybe 60-40 or 50-50 split between progressives and traditionalists, it was like the entire slate we sent to conference was progressive, save for one person. And so that happened in other conferences. And so going into the 2020 General Conference, it looked like the 2019 General Conference was all going to be undone. Then the other thing that happened was COVID, but I'll come to that in a minute. The other thing that happened was there was a group of leaders, bishops, representatives of the various advocacy groups, who got together with a mediator and came up with what was called the Protocol for Separation. And this was basically a negotiated splitting up of the United Methodist Church. And the conservatives were going to leave, and they were going to form a new body, and the UMC was going to let them go with their property and give them a bunch of money to start the new denomination, and everything was going to be amicable. And this proposal was presented to the 2020 General Conference as legislation. And at the end of 2019 and in going into 2020, it looked like it had a pretty good chance of passing because everybody was just tired of all the fighting. One other thing that was significant was that the 2019 special session created a limited opportunity exit clause, the disaffiliation clause, that was going to end in 2023, as memory serves, for churches to leave and pay a small ransom and keep their property, or a big ransom, depending on what conference you were in. Then COVID hit, and the 2020 General Conference was delayed, and it was delayed again, and it was delayed again. And as the delays happened, there was a lot of suspicion. The committee that made that decision about the delays, one of the members came out and said, we haven't even tried to have a conference. They just want to delay the thing. And it was clear that the protocol for separation was losing support, especially on the progressive side of things. And some of the people that originally endorsed it kind of backed off from there, including my own bishop, kind of backed off their endorsement, or just said, oh yeah, I'm not going to talk about this anymore. And it looked like we were just going to go back to the fighting that we were in. And at this point, conservative leaders made the choice to launch the Global Methodist Church as a new institution, and to take advantage of that disaffiliation clause that was going to be in place until 2023, to start leaving and encouraging other people to leave, to join a new denomination, or to be independent, or do whatever they wanted to do. And so the conservative leaders, I think their calculus was, we've been at this for 60 something years, or nearly 60 years. And it looks like all the victories that we have made are basically going to be undone, and we're just going to reset to fighting. And the other thing that was clear was that despite their ordination vows, progressive clergy, or revisionist clergy, were no longer going to abide by the Book of Discipline, which is like the canon law, when they disagreed with it. And the revisionist bishops were no longer going to hold them accountable. So there were going to be basically de facto different standards in different places. The reality on the ground was that we were not going to be a covenant church anyway, with a common faith, a common practice, a common discipline. We were descending into kind of an ecclesiastical anarchy. And the traditionalist leaders said, you know what, we think instead of spending the rest of our life trying to fight that, and maybe trying to bring lawsuits in secular courts, and maybe getting more and more and more kind of shrill with one another, maybe the best thing for the kingdom would be for us to do exactly what those early Methodists did in the 1780s, organize something new and get on with mission work.
Yeah.
Now, you could say maybe that's a good idea, maybe it's a bad idea, but once the leaders who had been leading the traditionalist network started leaving, then there was basically no chance that the traditionalist network was going to have the kinds of success it had before, because now they were kind of in disarray, and everybody was not sure if they were staying or going. And so I think it was kind of a domino effect after that, of traditionalists and conservatives saying, there's less point in us staying now than there was 10 years ago. And so let's just go to greener pastures and maybe be more effective in the spread of the gospel. And I will say another thing that the Reconquista folks need to consider when they accuse the GMC or folks like that of schism, is that they were using a disaffiliation clause that was enacted by the proper legitimate authority, the General Conference of the United Methodist Church. They were taking advantage of a legal framework that was part of their own canon law, their own Book of Discipline. And so it wasn't like this rebellious act. It was going through proper procedures and proper channels as set out by legitimate authority. I think that's important to remember. And we could talk about the jurisdiction question, because I think that just really doesn't apply in the United States for historical reasons. But so that's another thing that's going on. But they're doing the same thing that those early Methodists had done. And the GMC, I mean, ACNA, I'm a part of, has had really great growth and success. We're only 15, 16, I don't know how many years old we are now, 17 maybe this year. We've had really great success in growing churches and planting churches and bringing people to Jesus. GMC has had remarkable success in just a few years. And you've got to think, if you're a leader, if you take that same trajectory of success and you stretch that out for 60 years, you know, where might we be today? And so I think the calculus is just staying in the main line was bringing diminishing returns. It was not going to be missionally effective. It was going to just be fighting it out, fighting over an ever shrinking institution with ever less influence and ever less impact on the culture, when you could just perhaps in that same time scale build something even bigger, even more impactful, even better. And I think there was a tendency to just say we're going to be forward looking instead of just lamenting what really has been lost or taken. We're going to say what could we build, what could we create. And I don't know, I can't fault them for that. But I was one of the people who was like, well, once they left, this thing is basically over. And so this thing, I mean, the renewal effort. So yeah, that's kind of my narration of where we were and how we came through all this. So any thoughts, questions, or pushback or whatever?
There are a few things here. I mean, to speak a bit to the jurisdiction, I'm not super familiar with all their arguments. I think a lot of the theological claims made around jurisdiction theology are kind of terrible. I haven't been convinced by a lot of arguments for them, but they made a lot more sense with state churches, which is not what America is. And even if we wanted to like argue about jurisdictions back to the UMC, not UMC, the Methodist Episcopal Church and its founding, after the Revolutionary War, England said, all right, America is its own jurisdiction now. They're hands off. They weren't sending priests over. They weren't ordaining people to be sent over who were volunteering to be ordained to be sent over. So England kind of removed their hands. So, that's just a historical note there. I don't know how they try and apply jurisdiction. I know they make a big argument about state and region, but again, if you don't have state churches, for me, I struggle to see how that will ever functionally work in the first place. But I don't know enough about their jurisdiction arguments there. I just know that's something they bring up with jurisdiction themselves. But you talked about the development with like camp meetings and stuff. In the early Methodists, like Oceanport in Pennsylvania is a town that formed because of camp meetings and stuff like that. So there was this big development with Methodism and America's development, and how those were really closely tied, just like Methodism in America. Let's take a look at a Wesleyan stance here. How do you evaluate a movement? How do you evaluate people and with spiritual gifts? You evaluate them by their fruits, and not the short-term fruits, by their long-term fruits. So that's, are people being made holy? Are lives being transformed? Are they bearing the fruit of the Spirit? And is it consistent? And is it lasting? Is it bringing people to repentance? I think it's kind of undeniable if you look through history. When you look at the American Methodists and other movements, and like as you were talking about with the fruits of the GMC, ACNA, like there are fruits being had that, we still need to see the long-term effect. But in the short term, it looks like the fruits that are promised to come with revival and renewal and the formation of the church there. You talked about some of the other things. One thing I know that's been a big question is, it got to the point where there was kind of nothing that could be done about the clergy who were breaking the Book of Doctrine and Discipline if the bishops weren't going to do anything. And right. I know if a bishop's not doing what they're supposed to be doing, it of course supposed to go through a series of committees that are going to enforce discipline. But of course, if the committees won't do anything, it's functionally the same thing. No one's going to do anything about it anyway. I know that's what was happening. Was there a time in the history of the United Methodist Church where maybe something more forceful could have been done leading up to that? Could there have been anything done before? Because, by 2020, it was too late. Mm-hmm. But from your experience and from your conversations, could there have been something done before that would have made a difference?
I think so. There were, and I don't remember what year this was. There was one case where a bishop came down to a bishop who was a revisionist came down and officiated a so-called same-sex wedding in Alabama, I think in Birmingham. And the local bishop, although she was not herself, I think, super conservative, just for the sake of peace and unity, asked him not to do it. And he came and did it anyway. There were several other in the like 2010s, late 2000s into the 2010s. There were a few high profile things where I think if the Council of Bishops had been extremely robust in their response and said, you know, we're gonna put the kibosh on this, so to speak, I think they could have. And I don't know how things might have played out differently, but I wonder, you know. So yeah. But okay. there were some high profile cases where they kind of said, yeah, we're gonna be in conversation. We uphold the discipline, but maybe not, you know. And there were also some cases where a clergywoman was convicted in a church trial of, and I can't remember. I think she was conducting same gender unions again, but the punishment that she was given was 1 day suspension, and she had to speak to the next annual conference meeting about that. And so basically she just got a platform to advocate her position. That was her punishment, you know. And so there was a lot of stuff where it was like they went through the formalities of the process, but the spirit of maintaining discipline was completely absent. And so and then, you know, there was really no recourse. The whole system was built on the assumption that people were going to keep their vows that they had made. And if they didn't, the people who were supposed to hold them accountable were going to keep their vows that they had made. But once there was a whole basically open conspiracy to say, yeah, we're not going to do that, and then it doesn't work. The whole system falls into chaos. And I do wonder for the folks who remain in the UMC, if that precedent is going to come back to haunt them in ways that they don't anticipate.
Yeah, and that'll be something for them to reflect on. And I know for Wesley, I mean, this came from the Anglican influence. I know a lot of the American church as a whole has kind of dropped this, and I really think we all need to pick it back up. But church discipline was considered one of the marks of the church, right? The right preaching of the word, the sacraments, and discipline. If you miss any of those three marks, you weren't a church. You know, I think that is something we need to recover. And I know the American culture has never been kosher with that. We've always kind of been a bit more individualistic from the founding and bucked at institutions. But I think we're seeing a lot of the fruits of that, not just here in Methodism, but like, you know, everywhere. So I think that's a conversation to have. But, and I'll bring up one thing from my article that I talked about. One of the big punchlines is, I think in the conclusion, is the guilt of a separation, of the physical splitting, happens long before the actual physical split happens. You know, when Paul's condemning the Corinthians for divisions, for schismatas, he's doing it while they're still institutionally united. And I think that's what we see happen with not just like the UMC. We see that we saw that happen with the PCUSA. It's going to keep happening. But there's this internal thing that happens long before you get to the physical split that shows what was already the spiritual reality. We were kind of just catching up to it. Now, of course, the ideal is always remove the people who are causing the problems. But as we see, that is not what always happens. So we've got to live with the reality of, what do you do then when you have this clear separation and division from the gospel truth at the top levels? How then do you handle that? And like you said, I can't fault anyone for choosing to leave. I don't think there's any theological or moral grounds anyone could bring up to actually levy a just condemnation there. And that stinks. You know, it sucks that the split happened and it's a tragedy, but it is what it is. And we now get to see a new age where, you know, hopefully there's going to be continued fruit showing up in a lot of these movements here. I see our time is running a bit low. So is there anything you want to bring up here as we get to the end. And I will link Thomas Oden's book. I'll have several videos linked below, and I'll have a brief history of how the United Methodist Church came to form from splits and mergers down below for anyone interested as well.
Yeah. I would just say absolutely to what you were just saying. I was telling people for years, we are already divided, in fact, spiritually divided, emotionally and personally divided off from one another long before the institutional split ever happened. And that spiritual issue, I think, is what the Bible, as you just said, is really most concerned about. And that's something we all need to look at our own selves. And are we contributing to that kind of division? And God help us, and, to not. So anyway, thank you for the opportunity to share this. And any comments are very welcome, and all that good stuff.
All right. Thank you so much for your time, Father Hickson. Have a wonderful and blessed day. And everyone in the comments, please be respectful, courteous, and let's have a good conversation.